Andrew is a native Virginian, a graduate of William and Mary and Wake Forest. We will bounce you out of the room, Hal. And Wake Forest University Divinity School, and his PhD from Florida State in Tallahassee. He has written The History of the Alliance of Baptists, which first brought him to many of our attentions. It was Paula Dempsey who's with us today. Paula, where are you, Paula? Paula is with us today, who first really put, I think, the idea of the book in your head. And that was some 5-6 years ago, or perhaps longer than that. So would you join me in welcoming Andrew Gardner to Binkley?
Thank you so much. It is good to be with you all. I am happy to be here. Thank you so much. It is great to be here for the rollout of this book at Binkley Church. And as Marcus said, this book had a beginning, I think it's 2016, actually. I would say this book had two beginnings, I think, over two brunches. Both had one thing in common, and that was Bob Seymour. And so in 2016, Paula and I were going around to a couple of churches, I think in North Carolina, and ending up in Atlanta with the Alliance of Baptist History that I had worked on, that we were showing to a couple of congregations. I think we were celebrating the Alliance's 30th birthday. And Paula suggested we stop and have brunch with Bob. I remember just being so captivated, I think, in connecting Binkley's history a little bit with my own personal history, that I had considered the University of North Carolina. It was out of state, and William and Mary was a great school in state that was closer to home, and that's where I ended up. But the University of North Carolina had been something I had considered largely because my grandfather and my uncle were huge Tar Heels fans. And I loved the idea of hearing the story of this congregation, that we can say Dean Smith had a lot of influence on the Tar Heels, but I think this congregation also had a lot of influence on the Tar Heels if we think about Dean Smith's relationship to Binkley in that way. So I was really captivated by this story, and I believe Binkley was in pastoral transition at the time, and a number of things were up in the air and it didn't work. And then in 2019, there was another brunch that I had with Marcus and Bob at Breadman's. I was in town in Greenville, North Carolina, for a conference at ECU, and drove over for brunch. And I remember, I'll never forget Bob's order at Breadman's. He was very decisive in his order. Crispy bacon, 2 slices of nice crispy bacon. And I think I just ordered exactly what he did. He was so confident in his order that I asked exactly what he did. He had ordered. And so we had a conversation about what we would envision this type of history would look like. And we were both very much in agreement, all of us, that this would not be a hagiography. I think many of us had, all three of us had thought about congregational histories, and that congregational histories can be relatively boring. I will be the first to admit that as a historian, that I tried very hard, and I think I was fairly successful in making a history that Bob would be proud of, that is not a hagiography and is also not very boring. So Marcus asked me to talk a little bit about the writing process, what's in there, what's in the book. And so, in some ways, I don't want this to feel like an extended sales pitch, because I think you have already gotten your copies, but perhaps an examination of what you can expect to find. And so, Jessica Stokes, if you could... So in terms of beginnings, I talked a little bit about the beginnings of this project in these brunches with Bob, but it really my research started with Bob Seymour, and particularly his book, Whites Only, a pastor's retrospective on signs of the New South. and a number of his sermons that I believe here in the church you all have every one of Bob Seymour's sermons. And so I visited in 2019 for Founders Day, and got to see some of Bob's sermons in there, made some scans of them. And this became kind of my early entrance into learning about Binkley, that Bob talks a lot about Binkley from his book. I found some pretty interesting sermons from the 1960s where Bob was preaching about a universal basic income in the 60s, and some other really interesting things that I would not have expected from a Baptist church in the 1960s that only kind of increased my interest in Binkley's history. And so from there, most of my work ended up detailing, you can go on to the next one, looking at the archives of Binkley that are held right now at the Z. Smith Reynolds Memorial Library at Wake Forest in the special collections. I believe these archives contain all of the minutes of Binkley up until about the 1990. And so they're all microfilmed. I believe that library got a grant sometime in the 90s to be able to microfilm a lot of churches' records and contain them. And so there was a lot of hours of me looking into a little computer screen that was, zipping microfilm back and forth to see different church meeting minutes. And you can see a couple of these here that I included, just scans. The larger piece down there with the School of Business Administration, University of North Carolina, is a piece that is talking about the new building and when the new building, this building that we're in, was going to be built, talking about some of the difficulties in getting permits and rights like that. I loved seeing this church memo with the letterhead from the University of North Carolina School of Business Administration. That it showed me how close this church has been to the University of North Carolina, not only meeting on its campus, but so much so that its archives will have letterhead from the University of North Carolina that has nothing to do with the University of North Carolina. It has to do with Binkley Church. Every now and then you could see in those archives, you would see they would scan both pages of minutes, and you'd see the first page of minutes, which would be all Binkley stuff, and the flip side would just be notes from some meeting from the University of North Carolina that someone was taking, showing the close. You'll also see the smaller one up there is very hard to tell, but it's the budget from 1963. Does anyone want to guess what Binkley's budget in 1963 was? 15,000. That's close. $11,625. So salary of the pastor was, I think, $6,500. I think things have changed a little bit from 1963 in terms of the budget. And we see also a photo of the early Binkley gathering outside Girard Hall on UNC's campus where the church met for its first few years. So this is where I really started, looking at these archives, looking at the meeting minutes from those first few decades of Binkley's history. Thanks, Doug. So in terms of the source material that I went to next, Bob Seymour's archives at the University of North Carolina, that I actually got a grant from the University of North Carolina to go and visit the archives and help in the research for this project. Ultimately, COVID-19 got in the way, and that was not able to be, but the archives, I think it's Matt Smith or Matt Wilson, I think Matt Smith, was the archivist there that was incredibly helpful in terms of scanning a lot of Bob Seymour's material and sending it to me so that I could have access to that. A lot of these photos, this is from the outdoor baptistry, some of you may remember. I think this is the first baptism at the outdoor baptistry of Bob Seymour. That these photos are all in Bob Seymour's collection. They're digitized, that you can go on and look at them in that archive online. Next one. Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Thanks. So the next thing that I looked at were kind of odd, interesting sources that may not show up in your typical congregational history. So I went to a lot of newspapers. There were a lot of newspapers even in the microfilm that I went to. The Daily Tar Heel has a lot of material on Binkley from its early days, a number of other regional newspapers. You all have also made the New York Times at moments in your history, the Los Angeles Times. You may remember this. But I also was able to find some other sources that I thought were interesting to include in a congregational history. We have some source material from an issue of Sports Illustrated, that I'm sure some of you may remember when there was an expose on Dean Smith, that Bob Seymour is in Sports Illustrated. Your founding pastor is in Sports Illustrated. And then at the time at Florida State, a number of scholars were doing some interesting work related to kind of government and religion, and I thought I might try it. And so there's also some FBI files actually in this history. So Junius Scales, if you may remember, is the only American to ever be tried under the Smith Act for being a communist sympathizer. I found that one of his references in his trial was actually the Baptist campus minister at UNC, Heron, Reverend Heron, right before Binkley was founded. I tried to get FBI files on Bob Seymour. They said they didn't have any files on Bob Seymour. I think, as a race agitator, I've got to believe that he had some files on him. I got to believe Dean Smith also had a file on him, but the FBI was unwilling under the Freedom of Information Act to. I didn't push hard enough, I guess. That's the real issue. And the rest of you all that are living, I can't request those, so you all may have them. And so in addition to those kind of sources, also a number of conversations with individuals. I remember having a Zoom conversation with Jim Wild and a number of other Binkley members, Howard Lee, Joe and Eva Klantz had conversations on Zoom that allowed me to kind of get perspectives from not only congregants but also former pastors. I talked with every former senior pastor of the congregation, had interviews with them about their time here at Binkley that went into this as well. And so, yeah, next one, Stokes. And so in terms of timeline, in terms of what this takes, writing-wise, and started in August of 2019 and finished writing in January of 2021. So this has been a long time coming in some ways in terms of the publication process. In terms of that writing, I think the fourth chapter that deals a lot with the licensure conflict of the licensing of John Blevins. That was a chapter that was reviewed by the American Religious History Colloquium at Florida State, so it was got a lot of feedback from my advisors and a number of colleagues of mine at Florida State, and then completed that again writing in 2021. Then the peer review process went from January 2021 to December of 2021 with the University of Tennessee Press. So a distinction of this congregational history that I think is noteworthy is that as I talked with a number of people who had written these in the past, they all never gave me all the full information about what it takes to publish a congregational history. And I didn't realize until later that this is probably one of the only ones that has been through peer review. And so the University of Tennessee Press didn't ask for any money to publish this. That every other congregational history that I know of asked the church to pay for publication. So it went through peer review, got really good peer reviews from a couple of really good scholars that do a lot that I know in Baptist studies and American religious history. And then from January of 2022 to today, May of 2023, took the copy editing, the creation of the cover, and marketing and all of that until we have a completed copy. And so in terms of a congregational history, and just a couple thoughts perhaps for you all to help think about what this is that you're holding, how you might use it, how you might think about it. I'm very pleased. Keith Harper, the series editor, you'll see in the acknowledgement, concludes that this may be setting a new standard for how to write local church history. And I think it's important to think about that because this is trying to be a broader history. As I had conversations with Bob and Marcus, that this is trying to encapsulate Binkley's place within a wider landscape of religion in the United States. And so it's distinct from what I would call a chronicling of Binkley. So there's not a number of people I know that work on these scholars say that everyone goes and immediately looks to the index to see if they're in there and where they are and to go read where they are in there. And there are many of you that are in there, but it doesn't go through every little detail of every potluck, every big event that happened within the church's history. But it seeks to be kind of a broader story and a broader narrative of Binkley. And so I mentioned in the introduction that this is a congregational history. It may be the one that's published, but all of you all have your own histories of Binkley. And so there may be disagreements that you have with some of mine, and I think that's great. And there may be ways in which you have interpreted some of the stories of Binkley, and I think that's great because that puts together, Bob has a sermon at one of the anniversaries of Binkley, I think the 30th or 40th, talking about kind of the tapestry that everyone weaves together for a church history. And so this is one telling of Binkley's history, but it's not the only way to tell Binkley's history. And so, if you want to go to the next. And so in terms of a little bit of the contents of the book, that you've probably seen some of the table of contents, but just walking through a little bit of that story, that the introduction hopefully is not too dense, but talks about what I mean when I think about congregational history and how it is a type of lived religion that some scholars will talk about. It's a type of micro-history that some scholars will talk about. It's a lot of different things, but it is really the life of a congregation and kind of its place within its local community. And so the first chapter will really look at Chapel Hill prior to the founding of Binkley and right up until its founding. I think I have that chapter, Founding a College Town Church. And so it looks at what was going on in Chapel Hill in the 1950s leading up to Binkley's founding, even looking a little bit in the 1940s, how you had communists that were visiting the Baptist campus ministry at University of Chapel Hill, that kind of environment of religious freedom, academic freedom that was kind of thriving in Chapel Hill at the time that led to this small group from what was then Chapel Hill Baptist Church wanting to found a new church in Chapel Hill and its close connections with the college. Chapter 2 looks at Binkley in the civil rights era, that I think this is probably the quirky college town church that is able to kind of participate in civil rights, that has, Dean Smith being asked to integrate the basketball team when he becomes head coach as part of his church work. Fred Ellis being asked to run for school board to help integrate the schools in Chapel Hill as part of his church work. Howard Lee running for mayor, that after, 10 or 12 years of Binkley's founding, as I was talking to someone earlier, that you go from a founding church and church plant really to having the mayor, the head basketball coach, school board members all attending. Binkley has just a rapid transition throughout this civil rights period. Chapter 3 deals with how you all manage becoming that, as I call it, an established church, not because you're receiving money from Chapel Hill or establishment in that sense, but that you become one of the known churches in town, kind of the place, I think as Howard Lee said, people knew if trouble was going to be made in Chapel Hill, it would start at Binkley. And so how you became that type of church and what you all did with it. and how you started founding new types of institutions like the Alliance of Baptists and helping with those organizations, American Baptist Churches of the Southeast, ABCOTS, and those types of institution building that you started doing in the 70s and 80s, ultimately ending with the sanctuary and that kind of controversy and the tensions around building a new sanctuary. Chapter 4 deals a lot with the licensure debate and conflict, as I talked about just a little while ago. And then Chapter 5 deals with more Binkley in the 1990s and 2000s. And as I see it for a lot of congregations, as Binkley has addressed all these different issues over time, from civil rights to then women to then sexuality, the challenge of a church and progressive churches in the 2010s and 2020s, even to this day, of seeing how those issues are interrelated and how do you deal with those issues when they start to overlap rather than when you deal with them individually. And so that's where it concludes. I think I leave about 10 years of a gap, I think, in there. So there's some historical distance between the present and this work. And so I think there's one more, perhaps. And just a quote from a colleague of mine at Baylor right now, Betsy Flowers. While indeed the tale of a particular church with its own peculiar personalities and in-house happenings, Binkley also discloses the courage and resilience, as well as the failures and misgivings of Southern liberal Christianity, which I think really kind of encapsulates, I think, a little bit of what Bob and Marcus and I had hoped to do, of something that celebrates but also challenges and inspires. So, that's a little bit about how I went into writing the book. Marcus said to leave some time for questions and answers, so I think that's about good time, about time. So I'm happy for questions. Yeah.
What surprised you most?
What surprised me most? A couple of things. I think one, I'll say two things. One, I think, most surprised at how much a church plant and so few people could do. So, I think in terms of what is like most inspiring about it, I think in a time when you are now in a big sanctuary and have a lot of reputation in the community, a large number of people. There's a lot of challenges within Christianity right now, mainline Christianity in particular, of attendance and all that. I think it's inspiring to see how much just a small community can really get done in a community when they kind of put their minds to things. Again, 10 years of being founded, and you have someone in the mayor's office, you have someone, coaching, one of the biggest, basketball teams in the state, country. And then even later on, in dealings with Binkley and its fight against the death penalty in North Carolina, with the governor and Dean Smith, that both of them had connections to Binkley at the time. That they're like that whole, everyone seemed to be having a connection to Binkley everywhere I turned in some of these debates. And so seeing how a small community, I think that was most surprising. There are one other surprising thing that I'll mention, I think, is I think maybe one of the harder things for Binkley people to read is getting a more complex perception of Bob Seymour. And so I think, there was recently an article on Baptist News Global, I think Marcus shared, on Bob and Bob's time in the 1960s, which I think gets everything right. But Bob was a complicated figure. I think some of you probably remember that. And, there are times, in the meeting minutes of the sanctuary, meeting minutes that's like, sometimes Bob has a tendency towards autocratic leadership. And so, Deacon saying that, I think during the licensure conflict, I had a conversation with Linda Jordan, a couple conversations with her, and Bob sticking around after retiring create a lot of challenges for Linda. And really, Linda attributes Bob to being the reason she left, less than the licensure debate. And then even some of the Barbie Chapel connections Binkley had with Barbie Chapel. I think Bob's experience with civil rights and everything created a harder. It made it more difficult for him to see some of the needs that needed to happen in the 1990s. And so there's an exchange that he has with Gene Hatley, or over a Gene Hatley argument, where Bob is using a lot of language that we would find very problematic today. And so getting some of that, I think that was surprising just because of what I had known about Bob and, the conversations that I had had with him, and wanting to handle that not as a full-on celebration of someone or a full-on just critique of someone, but being able to hold that intention. So I'd say those two things are probably what was most surprising. Yeah.
I think I understand that Binkley used to be Southern Baptist. I'm very concerned about how that transition came about, and what I gather is just the orientation of the kinds of issues, social justice issues, that were on the minds of those people in the process at that time. But could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So Binkley was a Southern Baptist church when it was founded. And I talk about this some in the first chapter about what does it mean when we say Baptist? What does it mean when we say Southern Baptist? That those are very big categories that include a lot of churches. I think 33,000 if the Southern Baptist Convention isn't fudging those numbers, which they are. So I think there's a lot of churches within that category, and so I think in some ways there is a Binkley drifted away from the Southern Baptist Convention. I think we can also say the Southern Baptists also drifted away from Binkley, and so there's a kind of a splitting in that sense. That there are times in the minutes where a Binkley member will say something like they only wanted to expose the congregation to the good parts of the Southern Baptist Convention once they had an affiliation with the American Baptist churches. That was more, American Baptist churches were more Binkley's speed when they, in the 1963, I think, when they affiliated with the ABC. And there was a hesitancy of kind of participating in the Southern Baptist Convention. By the 70s, I think a number of Binkley members attended a Billy Graham rally and came back and were like, we don't think that this is our type of Christianity. So I think it was a slow drift away. And then in the 1980s, when the Southern Baptist Convention has a lot of intense conflict over conservatives coming to kind of take over some of, the institutions of the Southern Baptist Convention, what I found was Binkley had some involvement in that and trying to inhibit that, but Binkley was really concerned with the building of its sanctuary. It was concerned with more local issues. There wasn't as much in the meeting minutes of Binkley trying to preserve the Southern Baptist Convention as they once knew it. I think by the 1980s, Binkley had already been like, we've never really felt at home in the Southern Baptist Convention, that we've always had a better partnership with the American Baptist churches, et cetera. That said, Binkley still had a very Southern kind of ethos and kind of aesthetic, we might say. And so I think that's why the Alliance of Baptists became a really good partner for Binkley, that the Alliance had a lot of that Southernness and had a lot of that, what was familiar about what they liked about the Southern Baptist Convention, that they could continue affiliating with. So, thank you. Does that answer? So, yeah. Other questions? Oh, I saw that one first, and then that one.
Can you talk a little bit about what Betsy Flowers, what do you think she means when she talks about the failures and misgivings of Southern liberal Christianity?
Yeah, I think So my reading of that, and I think this comes out towards the later chapters, is the failures of trying to be able to see the interconnectedness of all the different issues that Southern liberal Christians are so passionate about. So I think a good example of this is looking at the licensure conflict, that I think most people would say this is an issue about sexuality, that this is what the church is dealing with. But at the same time, Binkley was also, had just called its first woman pastor after 30 years of Bob Seymour, who is nuclear family, married. And so I think in some ways, as I talk about, there's some issues of dealing with issues of sexuality, also dealing with issues of gender and sexism within that conflict. And so the struggle for liberal congregations to be able to see that both of these things are happening simultaneously. And so once you get into the 1990s and 2000s, as Binkley starts to take on a number of other social issues, you see this blossoming as both Jim Pike and Peter Carman talk about the ability to be able to take everyone's individual passions and issues that are meaningful to them and trying to find ways to show how they're related. And they don't have to be in competition with one another. I think this is something that is symptomatic of a lot of congregations that are similar to Binkley, where you deal with one issue and you expand the consensus. Historians will call this consensus history, that you have a very clear understanding of what U.S. history is, and then you're like, well, we're missing the black perspective. So we're going to carve out a little area and include the black perspective. And so it's a consensus, and then we're like, well, we need women, and we're going to include women. And you slowly start adding on to what is still a kind of white-centered perspective, and not being able to see the ways that these are all overlapping to create one. So I think that's what she's talking about, and I think that's the challenge that the Alliance certainly sees today and the issues that it's dealing with, that I see some in Binkley's history that I talk about that I think is not unique. But that's, I think, what she kind of sees in some ways, the ways in which their commitments kind of get in the way of what they really want to do. Yeah. And then I saw.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you mentioned peer review. I think that's great you got that. I'm surprised you could get substantive input. Can you give me an example of something that you found helpful during that process?
Yeah, I think, I think the most helpful comment was from actually the series editor, and wanting to include more about how Binkley related to politics, and particularly the Democratic Party. So most of those peer review is less specific about Binkley and more about the broader context of how is Binkley fitting into that. And so a good example of this is that within a lot of historians will talk about, and it's probably no surprise to you that evangelical Christians in the Republican Party are pretty closely aligned, and they have been, I think, probably since the 1980s, and we can see that with the moral majority and other things. And this has been well documented within kind of history and scholarship. Less documented has been how progressive congregations have engaged with Democratic Party politics. And so that was a helpful comment to include a couple chapters and talk a little bit more about that, of the way Binkley related to politics in that way. Yeah. And then
A silly clarification. I assume when you mentioned Bob Seymour and Sports Illustrated, it was not the swimsuit edition.
yes, it was not the swimsuit edition. It was not the swimsuit edition. I can clarify that for sure. And I'm sorry? Not that I'm aware of. I didn't look at every page of that Sports Illustrated issue, but definitely not in the article that I cited. Yeah. Other questions? Was that one in the back? Or is that a head scratch? Okay. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, Paul.
I mean, there's a lot of effort. So would you be interested in exploring other churches and their stories?
I think so, perhaps in different mediums. So I think, perhaps shorter, like more journal articles than something in this length right now. There's some other stuff like my dissertation that I haven't gotten to yet that I want to get to. And there's some other things that I'd like to work on revising for publication, I think, at this moment. But I think certainly finding the right hook, I think it would require finding the right hook for me of something that's particularly interesting. That Binkley had a lot of hooks for me personally, and based upon what I had done with the Alliance that had made it really interesting. So,
well, what do you think is the value of this for the local congregation? What would you hope this congregation gleans from this to help it with its look toward how it wants to be the church for today and tomorrow?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'd hope that the narrative and argument can open up new ways to thinking and asking questions about who Binkley is and what Binkley can be. And so I think that's the value of having a church history rather than a chronicle, whereas a chronicle becomes the dense, these 3 people joined the diaconate in this year and they served for this many years. And then you get through all the details, but it doesn't give you a way of thinking about the larger story of the church and arguments about where it's been, where it's going. And so I'd hope that each chapter has kind of its own argument about what was Binkley like, what was happening during this time period. So I'd like to think that those can open up questions for thinking about Binkley today. So, what does it mean becoming an established church where you have the big steeple sanctuary versus having, just kind of multiple services in a fellowship hall like this? What was gained, what was lost? That there's a trade-off in all of that. And so being able to ask those questions and think about those questions as other decisions come up, knowing that history is what I would hope would be of value. Thanks.
You said you had not completed your dissertation, so I'm wondering if you need an academic advisor.
I'm sorry?
I wonder if you need a new academic advisor. But actually, I have a question for Paula.
Okay.
About this. So, Paula, you were influential in the decision to have this history written about Binkley, I think, right? And you attested to that.
I think the idea.
I did.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I guess, Paul, what I would want to know from you is of what, I know you're not with Atlantis anymore, but you'll always be the Atlantis person. So, what do you think is good for the Alliance to have this book published?
I think that learning about other churches' stories, the courageous acts as well as the stumbles, can empower and encourage other churches as they are trying to discern their calling, their path, where they can make a difference in their context, in their community. I mean, one of the early things that the Alliance, AWAB, and Baptist Peace Fellowship did was publish some stories about the churches that were confronted with sexuality issues before they had arrived at their response. An individual made them have to make a response to human sexuality and differences. And those stories are in there, and they've been so helpful to congregations who are trying to figure out and navigate that path also. So churches that are navigating this world and want to know how we can impact our local communities can learn from your story in marvelous ways. And you can learn from your mistakes. I mean, wherever the landmines, the quicksands over there, don't go that way. There's just so much we can learn from each other. In Baptist life, we silo ourselves and don't do that. We really are bad in Baptist life for that. So we need to talk more and learn from each other.
We don't have an overstructure. The bad news is we don't have an overstructure.
Right.
Yeah, and I think I can add, just from my own experience, I attend Lakeshore in Waco. It was founded in 1959 was involved in the civil rights movement. And I had a conversation with someone recently about their sanctuary, and they didn't build the big sanctuary. So their fellowship hall is where worship takes place, and they have a kitchen in the back. So you preach to the kitchen in some ways. And so it has, a lot of Alliance congregations have very similar stories and have dealt with very similar issues. And I would say also, I can speak, Stokes and I went to Wake Forest School of Divinity together, and I think, Stokes can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for a lot of divinity school students, places like Binkley are really held up as being like, this is where I'd like to be one day. And there aren't a lot of Binkleys out there. And so being able to have a more concrete and tangible history, I think, is helpful for pastors at churches that aren't like Binkley to know how they might be able to strive to become a little bit more, what decisions they might be able to make to move the needle a little more in their congregation. Whereas I was talking with another pastor recently at the Alliance that is in like a really big pulpit, and I'm like, well, everyone knows you're in that pulpit. Like that's what they're thinking about. And he's like, well, it's not as glamorous as you might think. And I'm like, it's because people don't know that. It's the perception that people have. And so giving a kind of more real grounded history, I think, is helpful in that sense for.
How far to the Alliance, and where do you see the role of bringing in?
I'm on the board, so I should know this. I think it's about 130 congregations, 140, give or take. It's been, I think, fairly consistent over the last 5 or 6 years. It's growing in terms of staff and contributions. And I mean, I think Binkley, for myself on the board, Binkley is one of the original Alliance churches that has been involved from the very beginning. So, I mean, I think of Binkley in the same breath of thinking about places like Pullen, places like Oakhurst that have been an Alliance partner and really supportive congregation from the very beginning. So that's how I at least think about Binkley in my role, yeah.
May I add that once I had a conversation with Roy Medley in which he was so grateful the Alliance existed. And what he said was, we've got churches that really want more from American Baptists than we're going to do. And so the Alliance meets that need. I mean, so the American Baptist churches are very broad in scope theologically, very broad. I remember Jim Johnson once telling me there's some Schofield Bible toters in American Baptist churches. Okay, so American Baptist is a big tent. And so the Alliance gives Binkley a place to be with people who carry Binkley's concerns for issues in society right now. That happens in American Baptist life, yes, but they're taking care of the broad church where the Alliance is really focused on the churches that have those same social justice concerns that you have. That's how I would describe the impact you can make in the Alliance is significant because you can empower that particular effort in ministry in very important ways.
Marcus, we have time for one more.
For me, defining one, I think was the issue of eradicating lesbian issues. And it was, from what I saw, it sort of reinvented itself around that, from having pretty much focus on Black America and the church, to being concerned about more broadly about social issues in our country. And I wondered if that resonates with what you saw.
Yeah, so the question was if the issue of sexuality with the licensure conflict became this moment where Binkley becomes broader in some, and more concerned over a lot of different issues. I would say yes, entirely. That's, I think, what I found, particularly, in talking with Jim Pike, who was the pastor that came, in 1996, I think. He was more of an American Baptist pastor, whereas Bob and Linda had a lot of roots within Southern Baptist life. So you had someone coming that had a different, I think, Baptist denominational background, that he talked a lot about, interviewing with me, that he saw himself as, he had to do a lot of listening, that Binkley was very, very much hurting after that event, essentially, that not only did the church really lose a ton of members, but it also was in the national news. It also caused the Southern Baptist Convention to rewrite its constitution. So there was so much, I think, in that moment that was traumatic. And having someone like Jim come in and recognize that, it gave, I think Jim and Peter both gave Binkley more of an opportunity to allow more congregants to lead. I think I talk about that last chapter as every member a minister, that it's a Binkley motto, that I think Binkley really starts to live into that following the licensure conflict, in more so in ways than when Bob was pastor and there was kind of a singular head minister, in that sense that more individuals start taking responsibility, and that's where you start to see this blossoming of a lot of different events and causes that Binkley's involved in. So, thank you. I think there's one more.
Do you think there's any chance that this book could be banned soon?
Do I think there's any chance that it could be banned soon? You know, I don't know if university press books are books that many people are aware of in that field of, they have to go to popular books. They don't pick up a lot of books. And then one from...
We have this now, the past. Is there any possibility that after you do your dissertation and all, that you would take a sequel to this? Because I think there is an awful lot happening here.
Possibly, yeah. So I'm happy to come in and kind of see volume 2. Yeah, I know Oakhurst has done a similar type additional volume. We'll have to see how the University of Tennessee Press would deal with that and that. It could just be for us, though. So, yeah, great. All right, and then
I was wondering, I haven't read the book, obviously, yet, and I'm sorry. I'm planning on it. I was wondering if you delved into what... I came to Binkley as a refugee pastor, and I think we have a lot of those. People who have been in ministry and want a place where their theology is not a problem. But while I was pastoring and trying to grow a congregation, I was sent to see a lot of model churches that were growing and had diverse, large congregations and outreach. And I feel that we do more what I call secular ministry. We empower our members who are hurt and have taken refuge away from the large church, whether it be Southern Baptist or American Baptist or Methodist or whatever, and they have found a way to earn a living and to feel that there's someone in ministry, like I am doing. I'm working for a health provider. I'm on call right now. Some people are doing dog rescues and prison work, and we empower them to do secular ministry, but the church is not embodying the ministries and the outreach and making disciples of children and young people. And I'm just bothered by that discrepancy, you know, that we have so many trained, competent people and we're teaching each other. And I'm just wondering if that is anything that you run across in your interviews and with your book, and how you see that.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think there's a lot of ways I think I can think about that. One, I think in some ways, Binkley's DNA from early on, this is how Bob did a lot of, you know, Dean Smith, go integrate the basketball team. This is your church work. Fred Ellis, go join the school board. This is your church work. So this idea of empowering people to go out and do what you're calling the secular ministry has been part and parcel of Binkley from very early on. And then I think also, I did notice towards more contemporary 90s, 2000s, this idea of every member a minister in some ways be used literally. Every member is literally a minister or ordained. And so, I do notice that. I do also notice, having done some work with the Hartford Seminary on looking at churches in the pandemic, that the question of children and youth and doing that type of discipleship in the church is a struggle for mainline congregations everywhere right now. So I don't have an answer as to how that can be revitalized in churches, but it is an issue that I know a lot of people across the country in congregations like Binkley are thinking about.
As a follow-up, I think you jokingly said every member a minister, but I took comfort in being, in having standing in the Alliance and doing weddings and funerals for my community and being a quote-unquote minister, and then the Alliance took that away. They said, we no longer will recognize any kind of ministry except this chaplaincy type. So that was very hurtful, I have to share.
I'll bring that up with the board. I've definitely heard that from a lot of people, and as I was working on the Alliance history, that was happening at that time. So thank you.
Most of you know that the noted historian Winthrop Hudson was a member here at Binkley, as was Sam Hill. And I remember when we had that brunch with the crispy bacon and Bob, that Bob brought up Sam Hill to you. Sam Hill wrote the book Southern Churches in Crisis. And I think he was at the University of Florida when you went to Florida State, right? I think you had some communication with him about the... Okay, yeah. So a lot of work has gone into this. It's been over 5 years. Again, join me in thanking Andrew Gardner for giving us his attention. You should know that Andrew has just wrapped up a time at Baylor in Waco and is now going to LaGrange College in LaGrange, Georgia. And so he'll be with us for the service. There is an opportunity for you to have Andrew sign the book that you purchased. Dorothy's in the back. And so thank you for being here. And especially thank you. And your parents. Your parents and an aunt and uncle. Other Virginians are in the room. So again, thank you for being with us.